In the midst of his ascension to the throne, young King Solomon, son of the great David, stood at a crossroads. He had just inherited the throne, and the burden of ruling a vast nation felt heavier than the heaviest crown. There was no room in his heart for pride, only a deep sense of inadequacy. He knew that to rule a kingdom that stretched from the great Euphrates River to the borders of Egypt, the power of the sword alone was not enough. He needed wisdom that surpassed human understanding. That very night, in the city of Gibeon, the Lord appeared to him in a vision. A divine light lit up the darkness of the night. A voice that was like thunder, yet filled with love, asked, "Ask, what should I give you?" It was a fate-determining moment. Solomon could have asked for untold riches, long life, or victory over all his enemies. But his heart, sincere and humble, desired only one thing. He answered, "Give me an understanding heart to judge your people and to discern between good and evil. For who is able to rule this great nation of yours?" Solomon's request pleased the Lord. He did not ask for personal gain or glory for himself, but thought of the good of his people. For this, the Lord promised to give him not only wisdom, but also what he did not ask for: wealth, glory, and long life, if he followed his commandments. Solomon awoke, his heart filled with unearthly joy and peace. He returned to Jerusalem to begin his reign, fully confident of divine favor. Solomon's first great trial made his name famous among all nations. 2 women living in the same house came to him with a baby. One of them claimed that the other, who had lost her child, had substituted it, and the living baby was in fact hers. The second woman argued with her with equal conviction. The people gathered to see this unusual case. Solomon, seeing their anger and despair, remained calm, his face full of wisdom. He listened to each of them without interrupting, and there was not a shadow of doubt in his eyes. Finally, he made a decision that astounded everyone with its simplicity and genius. He ordered his servant to take a sword and divide the living baby in half, so that each woman would receive her share. The crowd gasped, unable to believe his words. No one could have imagined that such a just king would resort to such a cruel act. But everyone waited to see what would happen next. As Solomon had predicted, one of the women screamed in horror, begging the king to give the living child to his rival, so long as it remained alive. The other, on the contrary, calmly agreed with the decision. At that moment, Solomon saw the truth. The first woman was the true mother, for only a true mother would prefer to give up her child than to see it dead. True maternal instinct became the key to solving this difficult riddle for him, and he gave the baby to the true mother. When the news of his judgment spread throughout Israel, the entire nation rejoiced. They saw that divine wisdom dwelt in their king, and this fact filled their hearts with awe and respect for him. No one had ever seen such insight before, and they realized that the Lord was truly with their ruler. This was not just a wise decision. It was proof that the kingdom was under the special protection of the Almighty, which brought an indescribable sense of security and pride to the people. During the long years of Solomon's reign, the kingdom enjoyed unprecedented peace. The enemies who had once threatened his father David now preferred to make peace treaties and send gifts, seeing not only his military might, but also his wisdom, which was able to resolve any conflict. The people lived in abundance and security, and each man, as they say, sat under his own vine and his own fig tree, enjoying the fruits of his labor. It was a time of peace and joy, unprecedented in the history of the people of Israel. Solomon's kingdom became a center of trade and culture. Caravans of gold, silver, precious stones and rare woods arrived from the most distant lands, and all of it flowed into the treasury of Jerusalem. Craftsmen and artists from all over the world came to work for him, and musicians and poets composed odes about him. His wealth was so great that silver in Jerusalem was considered no more valuable than ordinary stone, and his throne was made of ivory, covered with the purest gold. However, despite all this material splendor, Solomon's true wealth was his wisdom. His sayings, full of deep meaning and insight, were passed from mouth to mouth and written down in books. Kings and rulers from all over the world came simply to listen to his wise words and ask him their questions. They were not looking for his riches, but for the divine wisdom that they believed was bestowed upon him from above. Thus, at the beginning of his reign, Solomon not only strengthened his father's throne, but also raised it to an unprecedented height. He became a symbol of a wise and just ruler, whose name was known in every corner of the earth. His kingdom became an example of prosperity and peace. His heart remained completely devoted to God. No one could imagine that temptations awaited him ahead that could shake his faith and lead to a fall that no one had yet suspected. It was a time of golden dawn, a time when wisdom and faith were inextricably linked in the heart of King Solomon, making him a truly great ruler in the eyes of the Lord and the whole world. After his triumphant reign, there came a time when Solomon decided to fulfill the most important promise made by his father David. It was to build a house for the Lord, a place where the eternal presence could dwell among men. This project was not just an architectural design, it was a grand statement of faith and gratitude. Solomon called to himself the most skilled craftsmen from Phoenicia and Sidon, as well as from his own people. He collected materials that were incredibly valuable: cedars and cypresses from Lebanon, gold that flowed from all over the world, the most precious stones that could adorn the vault of heaven. The construction began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Under his leadership, thousands of workers worked tirelessly. The stones were hewn in quarries, so that not a single blow of a hammer or an axe would be heard in Jerusalem itself. This was done in order to emphasize the sacredness of the place where the Lord dwells. The entire building was erected with perfect precision. Every element was thought out to the smallest detail. The construction lasted for 7 years, and each year he devoted all his efforts and attention to this matter. The temple was divided into 2 parts, the Holy and the Most Holy. The interior walls were paneled with the purest cedar and gilded. The floor was covered with cypress. Inside the Most Holy were 2 enormous cherubs, carved from olive wood and covered with gold. Their wings extended from wall to wall, protecting the Ark of the Covenant. Everything in this temple spoke of awe and beauty. There was not a single detail that was not filled with deep spiritual meaning. When the building was completed, Solomon called the entire nation of Israel together. Priests and elders, leaders and commoners all gathered at the foot of the temple to see the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of the Lord's covenant with the people, brought in. For 7 days they celebrated, sacrificing countless oxen, sheep, and goats. It was a time of great joy and spiritual renewal. Solomon offered his prayer before the entire congregation. He stood on the bronze platform and stretched out his hands toward heaven. His voice was strong and clear. He asked the Lord to keep his eyes open toward this temple, day and night. He prayed that the Lord would hear the prayers that would come from this place, and that he would forgive and bless his people as they turned to him in repentance. This was not only the dedication of the building, but also the renewal of the covenant between the Lord and his chosen people. After Solomon prayed, fire from heaven came down upon the altar to show that the Lord had heard and accepted his prayer and sacrifices. It was a powerful and visible confirmation of the divine presence. The glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the priests could not enter it, for the cloud of the Lord enveloped the entire holy place. It was the most vivid manifestation of his favor to Solomon and all the people. This moment was imprinted in the memory of everyone who was there. The Lord appeared to Solomon again, this time in answer to his prayer. He told him that he had heard his request and had dedicated the temple so that his name would remain there forever. He promised that if Solomon would walk before him, as his father David had done, and keep all his commandments, his throne in Israel would stand forever. But he also warned that if Solomon and his descendants turned away from him and worshipped other gods, he would eradicate them from the land, and the temple he had built would be destroyed. These words of prophecy and warning were as powerful as the blessings. Solomon received them with reverence, understanding the seriousness of the covenant. He knew that his wealth and glory, his wisdom and power, all had been given to him for one purpose: to serve the Lord and his people. He believed that he could remain faithful to this path. After the dedication of the temple, Solomon continued to strengthen his kingdom. He built many cities and fortresses, developed trade, and established peaceful relations with neighboring states. His fleet traded all over the world, bringing in untold wealth. All this was built on the foundation of his faith and wisdom, which were given to him by the Lord. His reign was a golden age for Israel. The people felt protected and blessed. They saw the Lord blessing their king and their land. Solomon's name became synonymous with wisdom and wealth. No king before him or after him achieved such a level of greatness and prosperity. But despite all his successes, there was still no trace of pride in Solomon's heart. He continued to believe that all his power and glory came from the Lord. He understood that without his blessing, all his achievements would be just dust in the wind. Solomon's fame, wisdom, and untold riches spread throughout the world, reaching even the most remote corners of the earth. News of his greatness reached the heart of the Queen of Sheba, ruler of a distant and rich country. She was known for her own wisdom and power, but the stories about Solomon made her doubt her own insight. She decided to go to Jerusalem herself to experience its mysteries and see everything with her own eyes. This was not just a diplomatic journey, but a spiritual pilgrimage. Her caravan was enormous. It consisted of hundreds of camels loaded with gold, precious stones, incense, and rare spices. Upon her arrival in Jerusalem, the Queen of Sheba was amazed by what she saw: the architecture of the city, the splendor of the royal palace, and, most importantly, the spiritual order that reigned throughout the kingdom exceeded all her expectations. She saw how Solomon's servants carried out their duties in an organized and efficient manner, how they treated their king with reverence, and how the king himself managed his household. The Queen of Sheba decided to test Solomon. She asked him many difficult riddles and philosophical questions that she believed were impossible to answer. She asked about the meaning of time, the nature of good and evil, and what is more important, power or wisdom. Solomon answered all her questions with such ease and clarity that she could not hide her surprise. His answers were not memorized phrases, but were filled with a deep truth that flowed from his heart. After all the trials, the Queen of Sheba, completely amazed, said, "I did not believe the stories until I came and saw with my own eyes. And behold, I have not been told half of your greatness. You have surpassed in wisdom and wealth the rumors that I heard. Blessed are your people, and blessed are your servants, who always stand before you and hear your wisdom." Her words were sincere and filled with respect. She realized that his strength was not in his riches, but in his connection with the Lord. The culmination of their conversation was her most important question. The Queen of Sheba, looking at all the splendor around her, at the gold, at the luxury, at the power, asked Solomon, "How can a man who has everything keep his soul? How can he avoid the trap of pride and not lose what is truly important?" It was a question that concerned not only him, but also herself as a ruler. Solomon, looking at her, answered with a conviction that was not yet clouded by doubt. He said that only a heart completely devoted to the Lord can save a person from falling. He explained that wealth and fame are only temporary gifts that can be lost at any moment. The true treasure is eternal life and peace, which only the Lord gives to those who follow his commandments. After this conversation, the Queen of Sheba presented Solomon with lavish gifts that had never been seen in Jerusalem. Then she returned to her country in peace, filled with wisdom and enlightened by his words. In this interaction, Solomon showed himself not only a wise ruler, but also a spiritual mentor. His words were pure, his heart was still undefiled. However, it was precisely this moment, when he answered the Queen of Sheba's question, that became the fine line. Solomon, giving her instructions, did not realize that he himself was in danger. The words about the vanity of wealth were spoken by him, but their deep meaning had not yet become his personal experience. He was at the height of his glory, and it is at the height, where the air is thin and it is easy to lose balance, that the most dangerous test begins. He was convinced of his strength and loyalty. The Queen of Sheba left, and Solomon continued his reign. A subtle thought began to arise in his heart that perhaps he had become too strong to fall. He began to believe that his wisdom was so great that he could afford to take a few detours. This subtle shift in his consciousness was the first step on a path that would lead him not to prosperity, but to ruin. Peace flourished in Solomon's kingdom, but his heart, once completely devoted to the Lord, began to change imperceptibly. Over time, Solomon took wives from the daughters of foreign rulers to strengthen diplomatic ties and ensure peaceful relations. There were 700 of them, and another 300 concubines. He did this not out of passion, but out of political calculation. In his mind, this was the surest way to avoid wars and keep his kingdom safe. He was convinced that his wisdom was sufficient to keep both these women and himself from idolatry. Among his wives there was one whom he especially loved, the daughter of the Egyptian pharaoh. For her, he built a separate palace. Then the princesses of Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and other nations, all of them brought with them their gods and their rites. They could not imagine their lives without their accustomed beliefs, and at first Solomon did not pay much attention to this. He considered it their personal business, and that his faith would remain unshakable. But over time, these women began to exert influence on him. They quietly and persistently convinced him that for the sake of their peace and the preservation of peace in the family, he must at least meet them halfway. They said that their gods were as important to them as his God was to him. They did not ask him to renounce his faith, but only to show respect for theirs. For Solomon, who always sought a wise and peaceful solution, this proposal seemed a reasonable compromise. He, unfortunately, agreed. Solomon ordered that temples be built for his wives on the high places near Jerusalem. One for Chemosh, the idol of the Moabites, another for Moloch, the idol of the Ammonites, and so on. These buildings were small and not as grand as the temple of the Lord. Solomon probably thought they were not a threat. He thought they were merely a symbolic gesture, necessary to preserve peace and harmony. But he did not understand that spiritual compromises are not small. The construction of the temples was done in secret, away from the eyes of the common people, who still saw Solomon as a righteous king. None of them could even imagine that their wise ruler, who had built a magnificent temple for the Lord, was now building temples for idols. This was his personal secret, which he tried to hide, and this secret action became the first step on the path to his spiritual downfall. Little by little, he began to take part in their rites. It began with small things, a simple presence, then a symbolic laying of his hand on the altar, and finally, he began to worship their idols. His heart was divided. He still offered sacrifices in the temple of the Lord, but at the same time, he participated in rituals that were abhorrent to the Lord. This was not a complete renunciation of faith, but a spiritual compromise that was all the more dangerous because it was slow and imperceptible. Solomon began to believe that his wisdom and blessings were so great that he could control the situation. He thought that he could serve two masters at the same time, and that his faith in the Lord would be strong enough to resist the influence of idols. He did not understand that spiritual power does not work that way. When you open one door to evil, it immediately enters your home and begins to destroy it from the inside. This spiritual compromise began to affect his reign. Plenty and peace still reigned in the kingdom, but the spiritual climate began to change. Prophets and priests who dared to speak out against his actions were ignored or dismissed from the court. Solomon, once the wisest and most humble, became arrogant and deaf to warnings. He believed that he knew how best to govern the kingdom. Thus, the golden age of Solomon's kingdom began to fade slowly. It was not an external destruction, but an internal, imperceptible process of decay. Each new temple, each new idol that he worshipped was like a crack in the foundation of his kingdom. He himself, with his own hands, slowly and inexorably destroyed what had been built on divine wisdom and faith. He did not simply turn away from God, he changed his heart. While Solomon was building temples for his foreign wives, his heart, once whole and devoted to the Lord, began to split. He tried to convince himself that these actions were merely political moves necessary to preserve peace, but his soul knew the truth. Each night he returned to his palace, feeling his inner world increasingly at odds with his outer actions. It was a state of constant hidden conflict that exhausted him and robbed him of his former peace. There were days when he would offer sacrifices in the temple of the Lord, and his prayers seemed to ascend to heaven with the same force. But then, at night, he would secretly go to the heights where the temples were built and participate in the rites of his wives. His mind was as if divided into two parts. One part remembered the covenant made with the Lord, and the other justified his actions by political necessity and love for his wives. He thought he could serve both. Solomon began to notice that his wisdom, which had once come easily, now required effort. He began to make hasty and wrong decisions more often. Arguments and conflicts, which had once been easily resolved, now dragged on. In his kingdom, which had once been a symbol of peace, signs of discontent and rivalry began to appear. His greatness seemed to rest on his old reputation, but something was changing inside. One evening, standing on one of the heights from where both the temple and the pagan temples were visible. Solomon fell into deep thought. He looked at the majestic temple shining in the moonlight and recalled the day of its dedication, when the glory of the Lord filled it. Then his gaze moved to the small dark altars, illuminated by a dim fire, and his heart was squeezed with shame. He understood that he had created in his kingdom, and most importantly, in his soul, two contradictory poles that could not exist together. His once clear sense of right and wrong, which had helped him judge his people, was now clouded. He justified his actions by telling himself that what mattered was his heart, which still belonged to the Lord. But he did not notice how his heart was gradually filling with darkness. It was not a sudden fall, but a slow, imperceptible slide down the mountain. And each step down he justified, saying that it was for the good of his kingdom and the world. Over time, this division in his heart began to manifest itself in his relationships with others. He became more distant and suspicious. He withdrew from those who had been loyal to him from the beginning and surrounded himself with those who did not ask questions. He stopped accepting prophets who dared to speak the words of God to him, because those words exposed his actions. His ears, once open to wisdom, now became deaf to the truth. He began to build not only temples for idols, but also fortifications for his kingdom. His army grew. His weapons became more sophisticated. He believed that he could defend his kingdom with his own strength, not by relying on the Lord. He forgot that his true protection had always been in God. His faith in himself replaced his faith in the Lord. Solomon continued to offer sacrifices to the Lord in the temple, but it was more out of habit than from sincere desire. His heart did not tremble as before. He performed the rites, but his spirit was dead. He built for the Lord, but also for idols, and this duality destroyed him from within. He tried to find solace in his wealth and fame, but they could not fill the void that had formed in his soul. He felt like the loneliest man on earth, despite being surrounded by thousands of people. His heart was divided, and he could not find peace. He was the king of two kingdoms, but he was not the king of his own heart. The spiritual division in Solomon's heart did not go unnoticed by the Lord. That night, when the palace was silent and the king himself was fast asleep, the Lord appeared to him again. It was not a visitation like the one at Gibeon, full of favor and promise. It was a visitation of judgment and warning. The voice that had once promised him untold riches now sounded with bitterness and sorrow. "You have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I commanded you," said the voice. Solomon, even in his sleep, felt his soul tremble at these words. He wanted to justify himself, to explain that all his actions were for the good of the kingdom, but the words stuck in his throat. He was naked before the face of his Creator, and all his secret compromises became apparent. The Lord continued, "Because you have done this, I will surely take the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. But I will not do this in your lifetime, for the sake of your father David. I will leave you one tribe, so that your throne will not fade away. This will be my reminder that I am faithful to my covenant with David, even when you are not faithful to me." There was as much mercy in these words as there was condemnation. The Lord did not take the kingdom from Solomon immediately, because of the promise he had made to his father. But the punishment was inevitable. It was a prediction of the destruction that would come the moment he closed his eyes. The prosperity he had built would not outlive him, for it was built not only on the wisdom of the Lord, but also on his own compromises. When Solomon awoke, he was shaken. He remembered every word, every promise, every warning. Fear gripped his heart. He realized that his secret actions had far more serious consequences than he could have imagined. But instead of repenting and destroying the temples, he gave in to pride. He thought that he could change his fate, that he could keep what was promised to be taken away. He began to look for ways to avoid the predicted division. He became more suspicious of his servants, especially those who could be potential rivals. He began to fortify his cities and army even more, relying on human power rather than divine protection. He forgot that when God decides something, it is inevitable. He tried to wrestle with God. The kingdom that had once been a symbol of peace was now living in an atmosphere of latent tension. People did not know what was happening, but they sensed that something had changed. The joy and merriment that filled the streets of Jerusalem were gradually fading. There was a premonition of disaster in the air. Solomon continued to build and expand his kingdom, but his actions were no longer pure. His wisdom was now mixed with selfishness and fear. He stopped thinking about the people and began to think only about maintaining his power. His rule, once wise and fair, became more authoritarian. It was the beginning of the end. The golden age was giving way to the age of shadow. He, the wisest and richest king, became the loneliest. He tried to fill his emptiness with even more wealth and glory, but they only increased his loneliness. He thought he could deceive idols and people, but he could not deceive himself and God. Solomon knew what was coming. He lived with that knowledge every day, and that knowledge poisoned his existence. He was a king, but his heart was a prisoner of his own mistakes. He had been warned, but he did not listen. He was the wisest, but his wisdom did not save him from falling. While Solomon was deluding himself that his secret compromises would go unnoticed, in the small town of Shiloh, there lived a man named Ahijah. He was a prophet of the Lord, and his heart was completely devoted to the Most High. He sought neither fame nor wealth, but only one thing: to hear and do the word of God. He was a man who saw not what was happening on the surface, but what was hidden beneath, and the Lord would reveal to him what would soon happen to Solomon's kingdom. The Lord commanded Ahijah to set out. He was to find a man named Jeroboam. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's most capable servants, placed in charge of all the work in Joseph's house. He was known for his hard work, diligence, and loyalty. But lately he had begun to notice that Solomon's wise decisions were becoming rarer and his character more suspicious. He sensed that something had changed in the king's heart. Ahijah, obeying God's command, set out. He was dressed in a simple but new cloak. There was no pride or self-satisfaction in his heart, but only a deep sense that he was an instrument in the hands of the Lord. He knew that his mission was of great importance, and that the future of the entire nation of Israel depended on his obedience. He walked along the road that led from Jerusalem, and on his way, he met Jeroboam. The meeting of two men, one a humble prophet and the other an influential servant of the king, was not accidental. Ahijah knew that this was the meeting that the Lord had foretold. He addressed Jeroboam, and his voice was filled with a power and authority that could not come from a mere man. He did not speak of politics or military plans, but of the spiritual state of the kingdom. Ahijah took Jeroboam to a remote, secluded place where no one could overhear their conversation. The prophet wanted this message to be delivered privately and without witnesses to avoid any possible problems. He did not want Solomon to know about it before the time, as this could cause him anger. This was a private but very important meeting that would change Jeroboam's life forever. In this secluded place, Ahijah took his new cloak and performed a symbolic act. He tore it into 12 pieces. This act, strange to the outside observer, was filled with deep spiritual meaning. It was a visual, physical embodiment of what was about to happen. Jeroboam looked on, not understanding what was happening, but in his heart, a premonition of something incredibly important and fateful was born. Ahijah explained to Jeroboam the meaning of his action. He said that it was a sign, and each piece of the cloak symbolized one of the tribes of Israel. He declared that 10 of the 12 tribes would be taken away from the house of Solomon and given to Jeroboam. This was a direct fulfillment of the prophecy that the Lord had given to Solomon. The reason for such a severe punishment was that Solomon had turned away from the Lord and began to worship idols. Jeroboam was stunned. He, a simple servant of the king, was to become the ruler of the 10 tribes of Israel. He could not believe his ears. He knew of Solomon's wisdom and greatness, and it was hard for him to imagine that such a prosperous kingdom could be divided. But he also knew that Ahijah's words were true, for they were filled with the power of God. Ahijah also told Jeroboam that one tribe, Judah, would remain with the house of Solomon because of the covenant that the Lord had made with David, Solomon's father. This was not for the sake of Solomon, but for the sake of David, who had been faithful to the Lord. It was a mercy that was given even in the moment of judgment. Thus, even in punishment, the Lord showed his faithfulness to his word and the covenant he had made with his chosen people. In a secluded place, far from the bustle of Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah performed his prophetic act. He took his new cloak, the symbol of a unified kingdom, and with a decisive movement tore it into 12 pieces. The sound of the tearing cloth was like the sound of Solomon's heart, torn by compromise. Jeroboam stood and watched, his heart aching with fear. He, a simple servant, had witnessed an event that was to change the destiny of his people. Ahijah, without a word, handed Jeroboam 10 pieces of the cloak. "Take 10 pieces," he said, "for thus says the Lord God of Israel, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes." There was neither anger nor exultation in the prophet's words, but only deep sorrow. He did not rejoice at the king's fall, but grieved that it was inevitable. Jeroboam, holding the pieces of cloth in his hands, felt their weight, as if they were not cloth, but the weight of power. Jeroboam was perplexed. He asked Ahijah why the Lord had decided to do this to Solomon, who was the wisest and most glorious king. Ahijah replied that the Lord was not doing this out of caprice, but because Solomon had turned away from him. He had forsaken the Lord, worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the idol of the Moabites, and Molech, the idol of the Ammonites. He had not kept the commandments of the Lord, nor had he acted as his father David had. His compromises had brought him to the brink of ruin. The prophet Ahijah also explained to Jeroboam that one tribe, Judah, would remain with the house of Solomon, so that the throne of David would not be extinguished. This was for the sake of David, who had been faithful to the Lord. It was a reminder that even in anger, the Lord remembers his promises. This mercy was not due to Solomon's merits, but to his father's faithfulness. It was given to preserve hope for the future. The prophet's words penetrated the very soul of Jeroboam. He understood that he was not simply being given power, but was becoming part of God's plan. He had been chosen to be an instrument in the hands of the Lord. This was not only a privilege, but also a great responsibility. He had to be faithful to the Lord, unlike Solomon, so as not to repeat his mistakes. After this conversation, Ahijah and Jeroboam parted. Jeroboam returned to Jerusalem, But his heart was no longer with Solomon, but with the Lord, who had chosen him for a great mission. He continued to serve the king, but now his eyes were opened. He saw that Solomon's greatness was only an outer shell, and inside he was empty and lonely. He understood that prosperity that was built on compromises could not be lasting. Jeroboam, once a loyal servant, was now a man who carried within him the knowledge of the inevitable. He had not sought power, but power had found him. It was not something he had sought, but something the Lord had called him to. He knew the road ahead would be difficult. He would have to confront the greatest king on earth. Thus, Ahijah's prophecy was not only a warning to Solomon, but also the first step toward its fulfillment. The Lord, through his prophet, gave Jeroboam not only knowledge, but also power. He set him on the path that would lead to the division of the kingdom. This was the beginning of a new stage in the history of Israel, a stage that was marked by judgment and mercy. Jeroboam, holding the 10 pieces of the robe, felt his life changing. He was no longer just a servant, but a prophetic symbol. He was the future ruler who would lead the 10 tribes. He knew it was not his own strength or wisdom, but God's will. After meeting with Prophet Ahijah, Jeroboam returned to Jerusalem, but he was no longer the same man who had left. In his hands he held 10 pieces of a cloak that burned his palms as if they were not cloth, but fire. His heart was in turmoil. He had been a faithful servant of King Solomon and had always respected his wisdom and greatness. But the words of the prophet were too strong to be ignored. Jeroboam could not believe that such a prosperous kingdom, built on divine wisdom, could be divided. He tried to find an explanation. Had Ahijah gone mad? But the prophet's words were so powerful that he could not doubt their truth. Jeroboam began to look more closely at Solomon. He began to notice his weariness, his aloofness, his suspicion. What had once seemed like simple management problems now became evidence of his spiritual decline. He saw how the king, who had once sought the wisdom of the Lord, was now relying on his idols and his own strength. Jeroboam, as he carried out his duties, began to notice that his king was increasingly out of touch with the people. Solomon had become more demanding and cruel. He imposed enormous taxes on the people to support his court, his army, and his many building projects. The people, who had previously lived in peace and abundance, now began to grumble. They felt that their prosperity was fading and that their king no longer cared for them as he once did. Jeroboam had witnessed Solomon building temples for his idols. He had seen the king visiting these temples in secret. He had heard rumors that Solomon had turned away from the Lord, but he had not believed it before. Now, after meeting Ahijah, he knew it was true. He realized that the wisdom he had so respected was only an outer shell, and that inside it was empty. He had not sought power, but now he was called. He was to become the king of 10 tribes. The thought frightened him. He was a simple man, and he knew that he lacked the wisdom of Solomon to rule such a large nation. He was afraid that he would repeat his mistakes. He knew that the power that had been given to him was a great responsibility. He had to be faithful to the Lord, lest he lose everything. Jeroboam began to wonder why he had been chosen. He was not a king. He was not a prophet. He was simply a servant who did his job faithfully. He realized that the Lord does not choose by rank or position, but chooses those who are willing to serve him. He was chosen because his heart was still pure and untainted by compromise. He could not tell anyone about the prophecy. Solomon was too powerful and suspicious. He knew that if the king found out about it, he would be killed. So he continued to serve the king, but his heart was already with another. He was waiting for a sign from the Lord that would confirm that the time had come to act. He did not want to be a rebel. He wanted to be a faithful servant of the Lord. Jeroboam couldn't stop thinking about the prophecy. He imagined himself ruling over the 10 tribes. He thought about how he would restore faith in the Lord and lead the people back to him. He knew it would be a difficult path, full of dangers and trials, but he was willing to take it. He was willing to serve the Lord and his people, even if it meant standing up to the greatest king on earth. As the years passed, King Solomon grew old. His once strong body became more frail, and his eyes, which had once shone with wisdom, now looked tired and sad. His reign was still prosperous, but it was based on inertia, not blessing. The wisdom he had once received from the Lord was gradually fading. He could no longer solve complex problems with ease, and his advice, once valued above gold, was now full of contradictions and doubts. He tried to fill the void that had formed in his soul with even greater wealth. He built ever more luxurious palaces, created ever more grandiose gardens, and filled his treasury with ever greater treasures. His harems were filled with women, his stables with the finest horses. But none of this brought him peace. He felt like the loneliest man on earth, despite being surrounded by thousands of people. He was a prisoner of his own success. There were no longer honest people around him who could tell him the truth. He pushed away from himself all who dared to speak of his faults, and surrounded himself with flatterers. These people were ready to tell him what he wanted to hear, and this only increased his self-deception. He believed that his greatness was his own merit, and that he had achieved everything through his own wisdom, and not by the grace of God. He forgot that his strength was given to him from above. One evening, as he sat in his palace, he looked at his treasures and felt that they were worthless. The gold and silver that he loved so much seemed cold and lifeless to him. He remembered the words he had spoken to the Queen of Sheba about the vanity of all worldly things, and his heart sank with pain. He realized that his words were empty because he himself did not live by them. He was like an empty vessel filled with shiny but useless things. Solomon began to reflect on his life. He remembered his first years as king, when his heart was pure and his intentions were good. He remembered how his prayers reached heaven and how the Lord answered them. But then he remembered how he began to build idol temples, how his heart was divided, and how he turned away from the Lord. He realized that all his suffering was the result of his own mistakes. He himself had destroyed what was given to him from above. His once clear understanding of the world became clouded. He could not find answers to the questions he had asked himself in his youth. He had lost his wisdom, and this was his greatest punishment. He, the wisest man on earth, had become foolish. He had lost his connection with God, and without this connection, he was nothing. There was no joy in his palace anymore. The music that had been playing before was now sad. The smiles on people's faces were forced. The whole atmosphere in the kingdom was filled with despondency. Solomon was the cause of this. His spiritual fall affected the entire nation. He became an example of how a person who has everything can lose the most important thing, his soul. Solomon realized that his life had been wasted. He had built a great temple, but his heart was not there. He was rich, but his soul was poor. He was surrounded by people, but he was alone. He was a king, but he was not a king in his own heart. He was great, but his greatness was only an outer shell, and inside he was empty. He was on top, but his fall was inevitable. In his last years, sitting on a throne made of ivory covered with the purest gold, Solomon fell into deep thought. He stopped feasting and building. His only occupation was thinking. He could not find peace. One day he took a scroll on which his wise sayings were written. Looking at his own words, he could not believe that he had once been a man who could think so clearly and purely. He felt like a stranger to himself. Remembering his conversation with the Queen of Sheba, he seemed to hear her voice asking him, "How can a man keep his soul when the world offers him everything?" He, then full of confidence and pride, answered her with ease. But now he realized that his answer was only a theory. He himself had failed this test. He was the one who had everything, and he had lost his soul. The bitter irony of his own life stood before his eyes. From then on, he began to write down his new thoughts on scrolls. These writings were not filled with joy and hope like his previous sayings. They were filled with sorrow, disappointment, and despair. He wrote that everything he had built, everything he had acquired was just vanity and a chase after the wind. He said that pleasure, fame, and wealth are all empty if there is no peace in the soul and connection with the Lord. One night, when everyone was asleep, he went to one of the heights where the temples were built. The moonlight illuminated the altars he had built for his wives. He looked at these lifeless stones and realized that they could not answer his questions, could not give him comfort, and could not save him. He realized that he had worshipped nothing. Then he looked to the other side, where the temple of the Lord loomed in the darkness. His heart sank with pain. He remembered how he had built this temple for the Lord, how his heart had been full of love and devotion. But then he had turned away from the Lord, and his heart had become filled with idols. He realized that his life had been divided into two parts. The first was full of wisdom and light, and the second was full of stupidity and darkness. He realized that all his suffering was the result of his own mistakes. He could not blame anyone but himself. He himself had chosen this path. He himself had built these temples. He himself had lost contact with the Lord. He, the wisest and richest king, had brought himself to complete loneliness. His once clear understanding of the world became clouded. He could not find answers to the questions he had asked himself in his youth. He had lost his wisdom, and this was his greatest punishment. He, the wisest man on earth, had become foolish. He had lost his connection with God, and without this connection, he was nothing. There was no joy in his palace anymore. The music that had been playing before was now sad. The smiles on people's faces were forced. The whole atmosphere in the kingdom was filled with despondency. Solomon was the cause of this. His spiritual fall affected the entire nation. He became an example of how a person who has everything can lose the most important thing, his soul. He realized that his life had been wasted. He had built a great temple, but his heart was not there. He was rich, but his soul was poor. He was surrounded by people, but he was alone. He was a king, but he was not a king in his own heart. He was great, but his greatness was only an outer shell, and inside he was empty. He was on the top, but his fall was inevitable. Realizing that his days on earth were coming to an end, King Solomon retired to his chambers. He did not want his weakness and pain to be seen by the people. He sat at a window where he could see all of Jerusalem, the city he had made great, and yet the city that had witnessed his fall. He felt that his life, once full of light and wisdom, was now shrouded in shadow. His heart, which had once beat in unison with the heart of God, was now broken. He took the scroll and began to write his last words. It was not a letter, not an order, but a testament, addressed not to his son, but to every person who would ever read his words. He wrote about what he had realized too late. He wrote about the futility of everything he had built and acquired. He said that everything that was not built on faith in the Lord would sooner or later collapse like a house of cards. Solomon wrote that pleasure, wealth, fame, power, all this is of no importance if there is no peace in the soul. He wrote that his life was like a journey that began with a great goal, but then lost its way. He was the richest and wisest man, but this did not save him from falling. He realized that wisdom that does not lead to God is foolishness. He wrote about his biggest mistake, his idolatrous wives. He confessed that he had given in to temptation to please people and thus betrayed his Creator. He wrote that his compromises had brought him to the brink of ruin. He realized that even small mistakes can have huge consequences. He urged people not to repeat his mistakes and not to give in to temptation. Solomon also wrote about his hope. He wrote that even in his failure, he was not completely abandoned by the Lord. He realized that the Lord's mercy is great and that he always gives a second chance to those who are willing to repent. He wrote that his life was a lesson he needed to learn so that his people could learn from his mistakes. He wrote that the most important thing in life is not what you have, but who you are. He ended his message with a profound thought that became the key to his whole life. He wrote that in the end, after all he had seen, understood, and experienced, he came to the conclusion that the most important thing was to fear God and keep his commandments. This was his last, most important message to the world. It was his testament, which was filled with wisdom that was acquired at the cost of bitter experience. After he finished writing, he felt peace return to his soul. He knew that his life had not been lived in vain. He was an instrument in the hands of the Lord, who was used to show the whole world that even the wisest and richest man can fall if he is not faithful to the Lord. He knew that his story would be a lesson for many generations. Solomon closed his eyes. He was ready to meet the Lord. He knew he had made many mistakes, but he also knew that his heart was full of repentance. He was confident that the Lord, who was so merciful, would welcome him back into his arms. He died in peace, leaving behind not only a great kingdom, but an everlasting message. After the death of King Solomon, his son Rehoboam ascended the throne. However, his reign was short and disastrous. When the people came to him asking for relief from the heavy burden of taxes, Rehoboam, instead of listening to the advice of the elders, followed the advice of the young men. He answered the people, "My father laid a heavy yoke on you, but I will add to your yoke." These words were the last straw. The people rebelled. The 10 tribes of Israel separated and chose Jeroboam as their king, thus fulfilling the prophecy given by the prophet Ahijah. Thus the kingdom which Solomon had built with such wisdom and power was divided. It was divided not by external enemies, but by internal contradictions. The kingdom fell apart because of the spiritual failure of its ruler. His compromises and his pride brought about the destruction of what had been built on divine wisdom. His greatness was only temporary, and his fall was eternal. The story of Solomon is not just a historical fact. It is an eternal lesson for every person. It shows that even the wisest, richest, and most powerful person can fall if he loses touch with his Creator. It teaches that true wealth is not what you have, but who you are. True wisdom is not knowledge, but the fear of the Lord. Solomon's legacy was ambiguous. He left behind not only great buildings and wise sayings, but also a bitter lesson about the consequences of spiritual compromise. His life became a mirror that reflects the futility of pursuing earthly goods without a place in the heart for the Lord. It shows that external greatness without internal faith is emptiness. Solomon's story is the story of all of us. We all seek happiness, peace, and prosperity. We all want to be successful. But his story reminds us that true success is not what you have, but who you are. True happiness is not found in wealth, but in the peace that God gives. Ultimately, Solomon's life is a call to us. It calls us not to repeat his mistakes, not to give in to temptations, and not to compromise. It calls us to remember that the most important thing in life is to fear God and keep his commandments. This was his last, most important message to the world. It was his testament, which was filled with wisdom that was acquired at the cost of bitter experience. So, the story of Solomon is not a story of a fall, but a story of an eternal lesson. It teaches us that everything we have can be lost, but our soul is our most valuable treasure, which we can only keep if we are faithful to the Lord. His life was not lived in vain. He was an instrument in the hands of the Lord, who was used to show the whole world that even the wisest and richest man can fall if he is not faithful to the Lord.